recording should now stop being in progress.
And some of them, what I try not to do is fetch things out. So that meaning I try not to force anything. If I don't think it, if it doesn't sound reasonably natural to me, it's not like I'm getting paid by the hour where I have to crank these things out. So if something sounds reasonable to me, so sometimes I'll write it up. And if it doesn't sound reasonable to me after I think about it a little bit, I'll throw it out. And of course, somebody could disagree and think something's not reasonable where I thought it was. So what I've been doing for very much off and on for about a year now is writing up pieces where I take something from general culture, and general culture can include a poem by Robert Frost, which I haven't done yet, for example, and it could include something from Superman. I don't care, as long as it works, right? So what I want to go over with you this evening is I've put together source sheets based on a number of things I've written, some of which I've posted, some not necessarily. I have to take a look. I don't recall offhand, but the idea would be to look at some of these source sheets together, and we can think out loud about some of what we see. You know, if you may come up with different ways of understanding things than how I understood, right? This is try to learn democratically here and get your feedback, right, in what we see together. Are there any questions before we start looking? We're good so far? Okay. All right, so let me open up. You know what, this is not the first one I was going to start with, but what the heck, I think it's interesting. So maybe we'll start with this one first. I'm wondering if it would be easier if I also sent you attachments via chat, and that way you can play with the dimensions yourselves so that you don't feel confined. Is that clear what I'm saying, to the way I present it on the screen? Yeah, and manipulate a little more easily.
I think your computer needs to be plugged in.
So let me do that. I'm gonna put it. I'll share it as well, especially that way. For whatever reason, somebody can't open it up, they'll still be able to access it.
Yeah, with the internet here, I don't want to tax it too much by joining the Zoom as well.
Okay. Here we go. So I'm sending the attachment. Okay. And I'm going to share the document as well on the screen. Take a look at it together. All right. So what we have here are two excerpts from two different comics. The first one is from Overwatch. I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to be, I suppose, dating myself, though. I think by the white in my beard, it's obvious that I'm probably not familiar with the video game, but I'm aware that the comic book is based on a video game. Okay, so that's what I know, and quite a few are available free through the Amazon Kindle app. So this is a particular piece. We don't need to get into the whole storyline, but it involves a group of soldiers who are dealing with a particular crisis situation. We're going to jump to the second row. Okay. If you take a look at the names here, it becomes pretty obvious this is not meant to be taking place in an entirely Western setting, right? So we have Lieutenant Amari, Aizad, right, Fariha, okay? Now, the panel I want to focus on here is this rightmost one. You know what, I don't want to make anybody feel excluded because Rena, is it? Okay, Mendel Breitstein, pleased to meet you. And Abraham or Avraham Gale?
Yehuda. Yeah, Yehuda usually.
Oh, Yehuda.
It's just my legal name that I use Zoom for work also.
That's fine. I have a different legal name also. Okay. So Yehuda Gale. Okay, fine. All right. So here, there's an old saying, who saves one life? It is as if he had saved the world. Khalil, the actual world is at stake. I won't trade it for their lives. So the conflict, with that, we don't talk about the details, but the conflict here is whether you can sacrifice, you have the mission where people's lives are at stake, and then there's the issue of how much you prioritize a member of the team's life versus the team's mission. Okay, without, again, we're not have to get into the comic isn't that long anyway. It's about 15, 16 pages. All these Overwatch comics are fairly short because if I understand correctly, it's a plug for the video game, but it happens to be illustrated very nicely. Now, this quote may seem familiar to us already, right? Let's go. So that's the first source. Okay, again, that's an Overwatch comic. If we now just want to ask one question, what source is this attributed to?
I mean, there's a Mishnah in Sanhedrin that
Oh,
same thing about
5 steps ahead, Tani. You're 5 steps ahead. Okay. But in terms of here, now the fact they don't attribute to the Mishnah, right, is not in of itself necessarily jarring, and we'll see shortly why it's not actually jarring at all. But I think we're noting that this source doesn't even attribute it to anything, right? It's just an old saying. I found that particularly striking. Okay. Now, there's another comic which is published by Marvel Comics called Miss Marvel.
I love Miss Marvel.
Yeah, my feeling is Jacob is a comic book guy. Is this correct?
Not as
Just the look on the face.
Not as much at this point after certain developments with Captain America, but I still do appreciate comics a lot. Yeah.
Okay. No, like I said, that was my childhood. Now, Miss Marvel is interesting because she's supposed to be a Pakistani teenage girl who's a superhero. She, whatever, I don't want to get all the details, but she can control her body mass, her body density, etc.
Yeah.
Now, if we look here, we'll find something maybe slightly less surprising. Here she cites the Quran, right? That my dad always quotes when he sees something bad on TV, a fire or a flood or a bombing. Whoever kills one person is as if he has killed all of mankind. Whenever he saves one person, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. Okay, so the first source says it's an old saying, and the second source cites the Quran. All right, so let's now. All right, so Tani referenced the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, correct? Right. Now, nobody here so far is referencing any kind of a Mishnah, right? So let's take a look here in the Quran. Okay. Don't worry with English for anybody who's Arabic isn't fluent, like myself. That is why we ordained for the children of Israel that whoever takes a life is a punishment for murder or mischief in the land. It will be as if they killed all of humanity. And whoever saves a life, it will be as if they saved all of humanity. Although our messengers already came to them with clear proofs, many of them still transgressed afterwards through the land. Okay. The statement itself is a little bit curious, and typically, well, first of all, who's heard this cited in an Islamic context before? Anybody? Okay, so you will sometimes hear
contexts.
What's that, Ani?
I mean, I haven't been in very many Islamic contexts, so.
Okay, that's fair. No, my best friend in my sophomore year of college was a Persian Shiite. I think he was like a pseudo-Zionist, but his dad worked for the Shah before they had to flee the country. So that gives you a sense what the family background was. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure when in Ms. Marvel this was published. So there was a point where I stopped reading a lot of Marvel comics and keeping up with that. So
she happens to be a cool character.
Yeah,
she's a cool character. Somebody I know was once making some really negative references, claiming that she's like a token character in order to get like a Muslim, maybe she's a Muslim female. I read some of the comics. I don't agree. I think she's a genuinely cool character. I think it was. I don't think he's racist, but I think he has so much of an axe to grind that he couldn't see the merit in the character herself. Yeah. And I think she is a good character.
But what I'm saying is, I might have seen the comic where this scene happens. I might not have. I don't remember at this point.
Now, I'm just going to throw one thing in here. We mentioned in the first source, it just said an old saying. And in the second source, it actually references the Quran. I'm just going to throw something in there. I have no idea if it's correct or incorrect. I'm going to guess that the person who wrote the first comic doesn't actually know that much about Islam. And he's just kind of like, throwing around some, get some Arab names and throw some stuff in there. G. Willow Wilson, if I'm not mistaken, is in fact a convert to Islam.
Yes.
So, and I think she's a very serious one. So this is somebody who knows a little bit more about what she's writing than than what we have in the first source. So she's, I think she is familiar with, whether she reads it in the original or not, I have no idea, but she is familiar. Now, like Tani said before, this is in fact a Mishnah, right? But not entirely surprisingly, nobody's citing it. And I think if you would type, and you'd have to play around with Google to see what results you're going to get. But a lot of the time, when there's a discussion about the value of human life, et cetera, you will not infrequently come across this as a citation from the Quran. Okay. So we already addressed the first question that I wrote up, which is how they differ and how they cite the teaching, right? An old saying versus an actual passage. Okay. And how does the actual passage differ from the way it's presented in the two comics? So that's just something I want to throw out right now. Is there anything about the passage from the Quran itself that strikes us as a little bit odd? Is it large enough that we can see it okay?
Yeah.
One thing that I found is a bit strange that it mentions the Jewish people in particular, the children of Israel, as
Good.
opposed to like anybody else.
Good. It's a curious sounding. Very good. Excellent.
And then the idea of like, although like our message, well, it's ordained for the children of Israel. So it seems like it's a decree on them and not necessarily for others.
It's very curious, right? It's very curious. It's a very strange sounding statement, right?
Yeah.
I happen to think, I'm going to throw this in right now. I don't want to make this into the main discussion point, but I had mentioned it to Rabbi Clapper, something that I think is sort of interesting, like in a meta way.
Mm-hmm.
This strikes me as something that you have to handle with care. Meaning, if I had a very strong anti-Islamic bias, and given the political situation, I'd probably be lying if I didn't say I have some bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it would be very easy to use this in a polemical context, right? That when a Muslim cites this passage, right? If you take it in its full context, it doesn't seem to say, it doesn't necessarily seem to say that killing is wrong in this categorical sense. It seems to make it sound like for Jews, it's wrong in this categorical sense.
Yeah.
So that's why I said I think you have to handle this with care for a couple of reasons. One of them also is sometimes you give intellectual honesty, but if somebody is, I'm just throwing in my own thought right now. If you have somebody who sincerely believes, and I'm not saying I'm a Quranic scholar, I imagine there are different ways to interpret this, and I imagine it's been interpreted differently by different people. But I wouldn't necessarily even want to push somebody to think that that's not the simple understanding. Meaning, even if maybe the simple understanding isn't that it's necessarily wrong for everybody to kill, it's better that everybody think it's wrong for everybody to kill and just leave it at that. Is that clear what I'm saying? Like sometimes you have some, it's like Nietzsche. Who did I hear? Rabbi Sachs talks about this in some of his books, that Nietzsche understood the implications of some of his philosophical positions, where I think he referred to himself as dynamite. When you remove certain things in a cultural way, you take away people's religion. And somebody who kept a certain lived a basic moral way based on Christianity, and they don't believe in Christianity anymore, but they don't necessarily realize that that's uprooted all of their moral foundations. Maybe you should just leave well enough alone and don't need to point out all the inconsistencies in their thinking, so that at least they'll still lead a basically moral existence. Is that clear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Sometimes you can let certain doors remain closed. So I think that this is depending on how you understand it, but at least taking it into English, it doesn't look good at first glance, but maybe sometimes it's better to just leave something like that alone and not make trouble. At any rate, let's take a look now at the Mishnah. And I think when we see the Mishnah, it's not so hard to understand why the Quran does say it the way it does. I think it's kind of obvious, right? Muhammad knew Jewish people, right? He wasn't living in a vacuum. He didn't float in outer space. So he understood where this teaching was coming from. Now, whether he knew it was a Mishnah and Sanhedrin, or from a different Masechta, or a Pasuk, I don't know if he had that. I don't know if he knew that well, but he knew it was a Jewish teaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
Either he heard it from a friend who was Jewish. He wasn't a fool, so he understood where this was coming from. So let's take a look here. Ketzad Ma'amin Eta edim al edi nefashot. So how do we threaten the witnesses concerning capital crimes or capital testimony is probably a better way to translate it. Does somebody else want to read? I don't want to hog everything. I'm okay with reading. Okay. If somebody decides they want to butt in and read, please do so. Okay. Like I said, we'll try to run this democratically. Right? So they would enter them and threaten them, warn them, threaten them. Shema Tomru. Perhaps you will say me'omed. Ad mi'ed u'mi'pei adam ne'amon shemanu. Right. So I think if you look at the Bartner, the way he explains this is it might seem reasonable to say, right? Sometimes a person will swear to something when they themselves have very much secondhand knowledge at best of the thing. Okay. Maybe you don't know that eventually we're going to really check you out. We're really going to interrogate you. You should know that when it comes to monetary matters, they're not like capital matters. These things are entirely different. Why? When it comes to monetary matters, a person gives money and is atoned for him or her, right? That'll take care of it. However, when it comes to dini nefashot, damu v'dav zriyotav teluin bo ad sof ha'olam. So when it comes to capital matters, this person's blood and the blood of their descendants are dependent on them until the end of the world. Right? This is what we find with Cain, who killed Hevel. The bloods of your brother are calling out. It doesn't say your brother's blood, your brother's blood, your brother's bloods. Damo v'dam zariotav. His blood and the blood of his seed or his descendants. I actually heard just recently on I think it was a news podcast. I think it was a minister speaking, and I don't know, maybe it was Machavin to the Mishnah. I'm not sure, but he presented this like his own. It was very strange to hear. He was explaining why. I think maybe it was dealing with racial conflict. I forget the context already, but he cited the pasuk in English, and then he said, "Why is blood in the plural?" And then the minister basically taught this teaching. It was a very strange thing. Maybe it was an Axios today. I don't remember where I heard it. At any rate, so what's the Mishnah telling us right now? It's telling us that when somebody dies, if we execute somebody, it doesn't just stop there, right? It goes all the way down. It goes all the way to the end of the world. Davar acher, another interpretation. Your brother's bloods, right? So that's a little bit graphic, right? The blood was cast, dispersed on the wood and the stone. That's why we were created as the individual and as an individual in the singular to teach you. And you'll notice Misrael, I put into a softer tone, if you want to put it that way. I'll explain momentarily why I did that. Some of you may already be familiar with this point. Anybody who kills a soul or a Jewish soul, the pasuk attributes it to him as if he destroyed an entire world. If you look at the Kaufman Codex, the word Misrael doesn't appear. So there's some question what the proper girsa is, right? I don't recall who I saw address this point, but I think it's kind of intuitive, right? If we're being brought proof from Cain and Hevel, which to the best of my knowledge, that when we talk about Avram Avinu, so there's a whole discussion, right? Was he Jewish? Was he not Jewish? Right? With Cain and Hevel, to the best of my knowledge, within mainstream Parshanut, nobody would call them Jewish. Right. So the idea that from this we're going to extrapolate this idea that killing or saving a Jewish soul, that's hard to understand. Right. Just the logic of the drasha seems to work better if we assume this is not confined to Jewish people. Right. But at any rate, there are different girsot, there's different texts. So I didn't remove the word, but I changed the shade of the font.
I think
Tom, you want to say something? Yeah, go ahead.
I did some research on this once. Isn't there like a Tosefta that doesn't include the word?
It does or does not.
That leaves the word out.
It could be. I wouldn't be surprised. And like I said, the Kaufman Codex, I believe, doesn't have it. But the
So I
yeah,
think
no,
that
thanks for mentioning that. I'm not sure. Yeah, Yehuda,
so
what?
I think that it depends. That likely that. So what this is, we're teaching them, the context here, we're teaching them some teaching that we know somewhere else. We're teaching it to them here to be ma'amin them, to make them, be scared. But I think that it's possible the original context of the teaching is in fact the other place where this idea appears, which is that a life has literal infinite worth in the sense that you can't trade some lives for other lives. Like talk about some, Tosefta, we talk about you trap a group of people and you say, if you give us one of them, we'll kill all of you. You cannot give them one of them. You can't give them nefesh echat b'Yisrael. And if that is in fact the case, it makes sense that we mention Yisrael because the whole context is where you have a non-Jewish army trying to attack a city, or trying to rape women, or trying to rape a group of women. Alternatively, depending on which one you have.
That's so funny because when you mentioned the context of with being ma'ayim, you mentioned if you look in the context of the mission itself. So my first reaction was, oh, well, that's why it would mention Yisrael, because in all probability in the Beit Din, we're talking about Jews.
Maybe, but by the Din, famously one of the things that's not always talking about Jews, just usually.
Right. No, that's. I think the second thing you brought in is fascinating.
Right. I mean, in other words, the teaching is that lives have infinite worth in the literal sense, not just like in a theoretical, like homiletical sense, but in a literal sense that we can't trade lives for other lives.
No, that's a really cool connection. That's a very cool connection. I like that. Yeah, sure.
I'm not even sure it's mine. It probably comes from the first time I learned this. The famous article comparing it to the contemporary codices of the Torah, saying that the Torah has a concept that lives have infinite worth and can't be transformed into money and other people.
Are you talking about? You're talking about Moshe Greenberg's article?
Yeah, the Greenberg article. The famous one. Not everyone reads it. Everyone reads it. Okay, that's probably where I first heard this. I'm not sure.
No, yeah. Okay. No, that's good. Yeah. It's funny. Sometimes it's possible that sometimes you'll read something and then years later you just take something for granted and then you read the thing again and you realize that it shaped the entire way you looked at the topic. So I wrote a paper at one point when I was in Revel, and I dearly hope I credited a certain article with it because now I'm reading it again years later, and I didn't realize that it really it's by James Diamond and has to do with the Rambam's view of Gerim, and it had a radical effect, I think, on the way I understood the topic. So I very much hope that I at least quoted him somewhat in the paper, because if not, but that, so I heard a Lakewood rabbi in Chicago once make a comment that something like Shikhacha makes a ganav out of everybody. I think there's truth to that. You look at however many articles and this source and that source, and it kind of goes into the mix. And the next thing you know, you're saying whatever, not realizing that you didn't actually put the two and two together yourself necessarily. So
yes, I'm not
try to be
promising
vigilant.
But yes, like I said, I'm not promising it's not in that article. It quite possibly is in the Greenberg article. But I think that general idea is important to understand, that this is not just a homiletical point, I think, is also important for the context.
No, that's good. It's right. It's practical, and there's probably a metaphysical truth here. I mean, for anybody who's not familiar, Moshe Greenberg wrote an excellent article dealing with ancient Near East law and how it viewed human life and monetary value in terms of monetary terms, right? So if somebody was very wealthy and they killed somebody so they could get out of it, or at least more likely they were going to get out of it. And let's say a poor person killed a rich person, so they were most likely not going to get out of anything, because human life and money were interchangeable. And how the Torah just has this radical break. And what's really fascinating is a discussion of later Islamic law, which actually seems to preserve the older system, which is sort of what's really wild. Like the Torah did this radical break, but the rest of the region, I guess to a large degree, just kept kind of running on inertia and didn't change for the most part, or at least areas there. Okay, so let's keep going. Right? So it's the converse is true as well. And then we also have this idea that the reason why we were created initially in the singular as an individual so that nobody can essentially say, oh, I have a greater pedigree than you have, right? Or I'm more worthy than you are, right? There's a very nice source, I don't recall where it's from, which also has something a little bit similar, but with a racial twist. The idea that Adam was created from 4 types of materials, and the materials correspond to different colors. So I think there was like a black or a brown material and a whitish material and maybe a reddish material, and there might have been a yellowish material. And the idea so that nobody can point another person and say, you don't belong here, right? That there's no, it's a very nice source for sort of like knocking out any kind of sense of racial superiority. It's, alas, I don't recall where I saw it. So, I mean, I recall literally where I saw it, which was on an Ethiopian friend's door, but I don't recall what source it was in fact citing. Okay. So here are just a couple of questions I wrote up. We can just think about them together for a second. In what context did this idea of saving or taking a life appear, right? Now, Yehuda, I think correctly removed it somewhat, but at least in our immediate context, right? This is an illegal context, right? This has to do with appreciating the gravity of what somebody's about to do in the court, right? Somebody's about to give testimony, which could affect somebody's life in the most radical way possible. And so somebody has to understand the gravity of what they're about to do. And how might this source clarify an expression that we saw before that was in the Quran? Not in a radical way, very simple. I think we already kind of said it, but.
That basically maybe Muhammad got his ideas from this source, basically, because.
Right, exactly. He understood it was a Jewish source. He wasn't claiming to be making anything up here, right? He's referencing a Jewish source. He references it as Jewish. It doesn't get quoted that way, but again, this is a case where I think maybe I would keep my mouth shut. Even, there's no need half the time to get into polemics anyway, and it's good that people take this to heart, right? Because it's a very important. This is an important value. We want everybody to have this value. This shouldn't just be a strictly Jewish value, right? It would be self-defeating to try to confine it the way it's presented in the Quran is not how I want it presented. I want it to be everybody. I want to hold on to this with both hands. So. So, they can get it from Miss Marvel or from the other comic if they want, and that's fine by me. All right. So I'm going to close. Are there any questions that we just saw, or I'll close this particular? Okay.
I think I'll make a comment. It's
yeah, please.
With the idea, like with the quote, there was the idea of like messengers brought proof. It also, like, seeing that it's in a Jewish text works for that idea of bringing proof in certain ways.
Could you just restate that, like say it a little differently?
So the quote from the Quran talks about like the messengers bring proof to like the children of Israel. I think there's an aspect that like there's a level of thinking what proof matters to the children of Israel, and it's from their own texts. I don't know.
You know what? Let me. No. Yeah, I want to take a look at the quote again now that you say that. Okay. Our messengers already came to them with clear proofs, many of them still transgressed afterwards to the land. Right. The implication is it sounds like it's a condemnation of Jews who aren't doing a good enough job of not killing people, which already is, if that's accurate, that's kind of distressing.
Right. But the idea of proofs, that's what I think that's a way that it might be a stretch, but it could be made to support the argument of this being a quote.
I think I heard what you're saying. In other words, just tell me if I understand correctly. What you're saying is that the fact that he says clear proofs implies that he's saying the equivalent, even though it's anachronistic, that they opened up an art scroll Mishnah and pointed at it and said, right, why can't you follow your own law properly? That's what you're saying, right?
Yes, exactly.
That itself implies the awareness that he's dealing with a Jewish text. Yeah, that could very well be.
Or
very
could
good.
imply.
Right. I agree.
Whatsoever on any of this, but I point out in the chat right, that it looks like in the Quran, like right before it, it's talking about Cain and Havel, which is exactly the same context.
Oh, very good. I forgot that. then.
It's also like one of the other famous contexts where the Quran seems to be citing a medrash. So yeah, because that's the part with the bird and the burying, right? So that's also usually like brought as one of like the clear like parallels. So that might also indicate that he has familiarity with the speech as a speech.
Thank you. Very interesting. I like how the juxtaposition here of Captain America and the Quran. This is like, no, it's good. It's good. I mean, this is the kind of thing I like. So
That's what we're doing here, isn't it?
yeah. That's what we're doing. Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing. All right. Good. Excellent. All right. Thank you. No, thank you both for the observations. I'm sorry. Who was speaking? Who sent us this on the chat?
Me, Sparmappa.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, because it looks like you're on mute, but I hear you anyway. Okay.
Yeah, I'm like sort of behind Jacob.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Our computer is on mute. We're all speaking through the microphone that's connected to Rabbi Clapper's computer.
because
Okay.
otherwise there would be very unpleasant echoing and
Okay, that's great. No, I was just looking, it was kind of like, thank you. It was kind of like ventriloquism. I didn't understand what was going on. Okay, fine. All right, so let's share the next source. And okay, this is very cool. And, okay, let's do this one next. All right. Let me first send it again as a chat for anybody who wants to file themselves. This might be kind of an information heavy attachment. I'm not sure. Oh, looks like not.
I mean, someone, not that we all were given the 145-page source sheet, but someone did write a 145-page source sheet. So,
Can I ask? 145 pages they sent?
yes.
Okay. I tip my non-existent hat in that case. All right. What do we see on the screen right now?
Yeah.
We see the top half of the page.
What's that?
We see the top half of the page. I think.
With the
Okay, fine. But you see something that says Hashkafic Hughes?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. That's all I wanted to know. Okay, let me see if did it arrive yet as an attachment?
Yes, but I can't seem to
think it's
download it.
open.
Yeah, I have the same issue. I'm not able to open any of the attachments that you sent.
Download it, but
Okay. I apologize. It's a PDF. I don't know what the problem is. Okay. All right. So
If you have an email, you could probably email it to us. It'll probably work a lot better.
can I send it to a common email without having to?
Yeah, why don't you send it to Rabbi Clapper and he'll forward it to us if he's here.
That sounds like a good plan. Rabbi Clapper, that's good? Okay.
I've not received it yet. When did you send it?
No, I had to move part of the Zoom thing out of the way just so I could hit the attach. Here we go. I'll see if I can send two at once to save time here. There we go. Hopefully it'll arrive in a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it should be on the way now.
Actually, I can export it. Or I can. Yeah, okay. Export it.
Did it arrive?
Yeah. So I'm gonna put it now.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to go back to this one, which I realize you can only see in part, but God willing, you'll all have a copy you can manipulate at your convenience in a moment. All right, so let's take a look at the first source. So this is from a comic book, obviously. Superman, I think it's called Red and Blue. It's like short stories gathered together on with Superman as a character. I'm just going to kind of give a quick synopsis of what this particular story is. I want to remind myself of the name of the story. Yeah, Human Colors. So the basic idea of this story is, if anybody's familiar with Mr. Mxyzptlk, assuming I'm saying his name correctly, right? So there's an imp from the fifth dimension who has no vowels in his name. Kind of the opposite of French, I suppose. And he comes and he gives Superman a hard time on a fairly regular basis. And then there's this creature from the same dimension who, as a practical joke, removes all color from our dimension. Okay. Now, as a result of this stunt, nobody actually knows what color is, meaning it's been collectively erased from everybody's memory, because since it's no longer part of our reality, we have no recollection of it. So he's trying to explain to Superman now what colors are, kind of like, how some things are darker than others. Well, colors are like that, but a whole lot more, and there's loads of them. I feel like I remember vaguely things were brighter. Now it's just to look at, they felt that way too. It was sort of abstract. I didn't think they were very important. Right. So the story continues. I just put this one page in. The story continues, and Superman is given a box with all the colors in it. I think metaphorically, it's kind of like Pandora's box from Greek mythology, and he understands that there's there's a temptation and there's a danger all mixed together. And there's a whole conversation with Batman. Should I open it? Should I not open it? Batman's like, I don't know what this color stuff is. Maybe it's dangerous. You only know what the imp said, but we don't know what it's going to unleash on the world if you open that box up. And Superman finally opens up one color and it affects reality, and then eventually opens another color, et cetera, until the world has color again. So that's the first source. And this is if anybody's familiar with Arnold Lobel, he wrote Frog and Toad Are Friends. What else? Oh, Mouse Soup. Fantastic book, and a very funny movie was made out of it. He has a book, Owl. He has all sorts of books. So he has one volume, which I think has 4 short stories in it. One of them is called The Great Blueness. And the story talks about how once upon a time, the whole world was black and white. And this wizard came along and he started experimenting, and he developed these things called colors. Now you can see here from the picture, it's called The Great Blueness, right? Initially, the first color he developed was blue. But then he introduces, at some point, I think it's yellow. I'm partially colorblind. So people can correct me if I'm wrong on this. But at any rate, he introduces other colors as the story develops, right? What does that, ask the neighbors when they saw the wizard painting his fence? I am calling it yellow, said the wizard. Will we have some, begged the neighbors? You may, replied the wizard. Here's a source which, if I'm not mistaken, I heard quoted in Rabbi Clapper's Summer Beit Midrash, right? This is from the Hitchhiker's. This is from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay, so this is when Zaphod Beeblebrox is going to steal a particular spaceship. So if we take a look here, we just need to look at the first part. You can look at the rest on your own time. On top of the cliffs stood a reception committee. It consisted in large part of the engineers and researchers who had built the Heart of Gold. Mostly humanoid, but here and there were a few reptiloid automaneers, 2 or 3 green sylph-like maximegaliticians, I guess, an octopodic, I'm not trying to pronounce that, or 2, and a hulavoo. Now we're here because of the hulavoo. The hulavoo is a super intelligent shade of the color blue. And here you can see he certainly was, in fact, British because of the way he spells the word color. All except the hulavoo were resplendent in their multicolored ceremonial lab coats. The hulavoo had been temporarily refracted into a freestanding prism for the occasion. Okay, so far we have one story in which, a Superman story in which color has been taken away from our reality. We have this wizard in the Arnold Lobel story, who's developing colors. We have the Hulavu, who's a highly intelligent, super intelligent shade of the color blue. This is a Calvin and Hobbes, which I particularly like. I'm going to give you a minute or two to read it on your own, because I feel like reading Calvin and Hobbes out loud, even though my children may like it, I feel it spoils them. I feel you need to read it for yourself. So take a minute or two just to look at it. If you can't look at the attachment here, let me know when you're ready for me to, or here. Let's take a minute so you can look at the pictures too. I'll actually time it. That way everybody can go at their leisure. And then we'll scroll down. Wordsworth, that's actually my favorite quote.
Yeah.
It's a former art major. I'll just kind of move this way, so I think we can all. Just expand it. Okay, so we have, here, let me just, I said I would give people time. Okay, so what do we have now? All right, we have the Superman source, the wizard with the color source, the Hulavu, and now we have Calvin and Hobbes, okay? What's the bait? Can somebody just say in one sentence, two sentences, what's the con that Calvin's father is, or the gaslighting maybe is a better term. What kind of psychological? Calvin's father in some ways seems like really abusive emotionally.
Yeah.
But I think he's probably in self-defense given what kind of a child he has. So what kind of a game is he playing with Calvin?
Well, I
And
mean,
this is why Calvin is the way he is because he hasn't. What's that?
I mean, he's just
Jacob.
trying to convince him of something. He's trying to pretend that there wasn't color.
Right, that the world used to be black and white. Okay. Okay, and the last source we're going to look at is from the Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster. If I'm not mistaken, did he just pass away? I think he passed away like a few weeks ago. Am I making that up? I'm not sure. I think recently. Okay, so I think this will speak for itself. On a high podium in front stood the conductor, a tall, gaunt man with dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth, placed carelessly between his long, pointed nose and his long, pointed chin. He used no baton, but conducted with large, sweeping movements, which seemed to start at his toes and work slowly up through his body and along his slender arms, and then finally at the tips of his graceful fingers. I don't hear any music, said Milo. That's right, said Alec. You don't listen to this concert, you watch it. Now pay attention. As the conductor waved his arms, he molded the air like handfuls of soft clay, and the musicians carefully followed his every direction. What are they playing? Asked Talk, looking up inquisitively at Alec. The Sunset, of course. They played every evening, about this time. They do? Asked Milo quizzically. Naturally, answered Alec. And they also play morning, noon, and night, when of course it's morning, noon, or night. Why, there wouldn't be any color in the world unless they played it. Each instrument plays a different one, he explained. Depending, of course, on what season it is and how the weather's to be, the conductor chooses his score and directs the day. But watch, the sun is almost set, and in a moment you can ask Chroma himself. And as the story progresses, at one point, Milo takes over and things become a little bit chaotic as a result of his, let's say, inexperience, okay? Now, what I would like to do, does everybody have a notebook with them? If not, that's okay. Like I said,
Give it.
my high school students don't have notebooks half the time either. So let's take 6 minutes and just quietly try to put them into two categories, right? And I don't want to say there's one right way and there's one wrong way. There's the way I want to approach it, but if somebody comes up with something different, I'd like to hear that as well. So I want to cluster these sources into two groups based on some kind of a rationale, that you see some commonality within certain sources that you don't see in other sources, and the other sources, could be, and you could break them up however you want, Okay, so let's take 6 minutes and just quietly do that. I'm going to be right back. I'm just getting some water.
Let's do one just to check your stuff.
Well,
Oh, that's-
obviously, but
Which is that?
you know,
And this is one just to check this out. Okay, let's see.
fair. But what about colors?
shared concept, but I guess they all share.
Yeah, they all share colors. I think they're.
Yes, I
That's kind of the discussion.
can. You already said it.
Just for anybody who's interested, I found the title of the article from Rabbi Carmi that I mentioned. I put into the chat. So you've got like 2 more minutes just to think about it if you want to play around with it differently.
This is a big book. It's, it was one of the teachers.
since I'm a high school teacher. 1.5 minutes to go. Basically 1/2 minute, and we'll hear what people have to say. All right, officially we have 10 seconds left, but does anybody want to make any suggestions? Like I said, don't worry about, nobody should worry about it being wrong. There are different ways. This is, first of all, we're not even looking at Torah sources yet. So the worst thing anybody could do is improperly interpret a Calvin and Hobbes, which I know some of my children might get enraged about that, but I think none of us think the stakes are too high realistically. So yeah, Jacob, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, not that I'm worrying about stakes, but because we only saw a brief excerpt of The Great Blueness, I was not completely sure where I would
No,
want
that's
to
fair.
place it. But
You're right. We're always looking at incomplete passages. So that for sure is a game changer. Yeah, go ahead.
but I thought of it kind of just, there's colors in and of themselves, just colors as a discrete absolute concept, and then there's colors when it's in the realm of metaphor or synesthesia, when colors relate to other aspects of existence. And so for the absolute concept, just colors in and of themselves, I put Calvin and Hobbes.
Can I just be sure I understand correctly? When you say
Yeah.
colors in themselves, you mean color understood simply. It's a
Yeah.
color as opposed to representing something else.
Right.
Okay, fine. Fine, go ahead.
So I put Calvin and Hobbes in The Great Blueness in there.
Okay.
And then in the realm of metaphor or synesthesia or color, how it relates to other aspects of the world, I put Superman, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Phantom Tollbooth.
Oh, interesting. Meaning, so if it's okay, I just want to try to unpack a little bit what you're saying. So in the case of Superman, for example, because he talks about, I think he makes a reference to a warm feeling, correct? The way they felt that way too, meaning it affects things more deeply than just how something appears.
Yeah.
And then in terms of
Hitchhiker's is a bit weird, but
it is hard, yeah.
I mean, it's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Right. No, I think I know what you mean though. In other words, it's the blueness isn't simply blueness because it's the thing itself. It's the,
Yeah.
and then in terms of Phantom Tollbooth,
Well, I thought that this, it was playing on the idea of synesthesia, so it's kind of like how,
if you mix things up, the senses will, oh, I see what you mean. In other words, you're playing colors on musical instruments.
exactly.
Oh, very interesting. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, very cool. Very, very cool. That is not where I think it's related to the way I'm thinking about it, or way I was thinking about it, but it's different at the same time. Okay, cool. So fine. So So Jacob wants to break the sources up into whether we look at a source as presenting color just as color, understood simply, or whether the color is representative, let's say, in some cases of something broader, or is doing something perhaps a little psychedelic with the colors. Very interesting. Thank you. That's an interesting way to look at it. Does anybody else have a different approach? I mean, I can throw in my 2 cents right now if nobody else wants to.
Yeah,
Oh, can you
I don't know
hear
if you
me?
hear it.
What's it, Tony?
Zipporah Mach was talking. I don't know if you could hear it.
Yeah, it's a Paramacha.
Can you not hear me?
I'm sorry.
Let's come closer to the
Yeah,
mic.
I'm closer, sorry. The microphone's not facing me. I broke them up into things where color exists as subjective reality, where color only exists when humans make it. Right, so
Okay.
in the Superman comic, it's an objective reality. Color was there, color is gone. The last thing, Phantom Tollbooth. Sorry, not Phantom Tollbooth. In whatever. In the I should probably actually. I can't look at the PDF while I'm standing here, so let me move my computer.
That's fine. I'll scroll up. We have
Right.
the Superman, and you're saying that's more objective.
Yeah,
it was
right.
different
And
when
then
it
as
wasn't.
opposed to in like the Great Blueness, where color is something that people make, right? It doesn't exist beforehand.
Ah,
In Douglas Adams, color is something that exists objectively, right? There's a being that exists. It exists and it is blue. Right. In the Calvin and Hobbes, color is something that exists, right? There, if you are like, I assume you meant us to like look at, the way Calvin's dad is talking about it, right? In which color is a thing that exists or doesn't exist, right? Objectively in the world, and things either have color or they don't, and the world switched. But it's nothing. People didn't create colors or not create colors, as opposed to in Phantom Tollbooth, where right, the orchestra is creating the colors. The colors wouldn't exist without the orchestra, right? There wouldn't be any color in the world unless they played it.
this is very cool. Totally different ways. Okay, fine, good. I mean, I think. Well, everybody can. Did somebody? Sorry, did you want
Oh
to say
yeah, I
something?
just wanted to say my version. Just I think I didn't like do all the sources, but I had a few of the sources, which is my
Yeah.
first group is the Great Blueness, and Calvin and Hobbes have in common that there are like people that they're talking to that are not familiar with like either what colors are or with like what black and white world is. And then group 2 is I think the first source, which I think is Batman and Calvin and Hobbes. What was the first source? It wasn't Batman.
Superman.
Superman, okay. Superman. And then Calvin and Hobbes, how they're both talking about history. That's the common. Okay.
I had a different breakdown. I think it's somewhat similar to Spermacho's. I think the Superman
time?
one and the Blueness one and the Phantom Tollbooth, like color is not inherent to the universe.
Wait, say the ones again. Say the ones again.
In the first, second, and last sources, color is not inherent to the universe. It can exist
Okay.
or not exist. It can be taken away. It can be created. Whereas in Calvin, I think the whole point is that Calvin's dad is ridiculous to trying to claim that, and color is fundamental to the universe. And to imagine a world that was black and white would be ridiculous.
Very cool. In other words, with Calvin and Hobbes, you're getting into the fact that Calvin's father is a consistently unreliable narrator, and therefore we have to really step out of his gaslighting and into the reality of that comic, which is that color is in fact not optional, meaning it is something just in the world, whereas the others see it as something that can be removed from the world, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you're in the world of the Phantom Tollbooth, then Calvin's dad's position is totally reasonable.
Right. Okay, good.
Calvin Hobbes is reasonable during the week. It's just not reasonable.
Did you just make a distinction between weekday and Sunday comics?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what, I think that's part of what Calvin Hobbes, that cartoon is playing with, right? It's a Sunday comic. The world is in black and white during the week.
Wow, that's really like fourth wall.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. That's crazy. The previous 6 days. That's really funny. Okay, so I'm gonna, if nobody else wants to weigh in, I'm gonna throw in the way I was thinking about it. Though I think after hearing what everybody had to say, my thoughts are going to be less clear than they were. But that's good. I'm hearing other thoughts. I thought of it as sort of whether something is, well, you know what? I'm going to put it into, if it's okay, I'm going to use Aristotelian terminology because we're going to see it in a minute anyway in the Rambam. So do you see something as being an essential quality, or do you see it as being something that's sort of incidental, right? Or what Aristotle would call an accident? I mean, he'd say it in Greek, not in English, but do I look at color as something which is fundamental to something, or do I see it as sort of an incidental quality that it happens to have, right? So for example, I think we would all agree that what is a fundamental quality that a block of ice has?
Solid.
Solid, true. Yeah, I was thinking of another one, but you're right. What other quality might it have to count as a block of ice?
Yeah, Parmasa saying it's cold.
It's cold, right? And so solid and cold, right? Anything else, and it's not a block of ice. In other words, it's true that Mexicans have some way of what, frying ice cream, even though I still don't understand what that is. But putting that aside, right? If it's not cold and if it's not solid, it's definitely not a block of ice. You could have a cold glass of water, right? And you could have a block of concrete, but neither one of those is a block of ice. So those are fundamental qualities to a block of ice, right? Whether it's transparent or it's blue or it's red, that's all incidental. You could dye it so it's a different color, right? Or you could not, so it's transparent, but it can be a block of ice and it could be any of those things and it's still a block of ice. All right. So the way I thought about these sources, and I don't think what I'm about to say is 100% different than what you were all saying either. I think they're all connected with different nuances, but the way I thought about it was whether you see the color as something, as an essential quality, it's a necessary quality, or it's more of an incidental quality, right? So Superman, right? So definitionally, this comic presents color as sort of incidental, right? If this imp is able to remove it, must be that reality can continue without it. Now, reality is altered. Reality is altered in this version, but the great blueness, apparently reality was chugging along just fine without color for eons until this wizard came along. So it can't be essential. The hulavu can't exist without it, right? If there's no such thing as blue, this thing can't even exist. It's not like a white person and a brown person. There is no such thing as a hulavu if you don't have blue, because it's its very essence, right? I mean, if you want to get Rambam, so it's not necessarily its form, because the form will have to do with the intelligence. But even so, there's no matter to work with. There's nothing to work with if blue doesn't exist. So blue is, in the Douglas Adams universe, it's extremely essential, right? Now, Jacob, are you the one who pointed out that or was it Tani? I forget, I'm sorry. That with the Calvin and Hobbes, we kind of have to be willing to step out of the narrative the Father is offering. So it's not really, are you in the Father's narrative or are you outside of the Father's narrative? But at least within the Father's narrative, color is for sure not essential, right? And also in the Phantom Toll Booth. I had one other source that I thought about bringing in from a fantasy novel, but I decided not to. At any rate, if you take that approach, it seems to me that really the only one that sees color as really an essential quality is the Douglas Adams piece. And everything else sees it as something that you can sort of take it or leave it. Does that make sense what I'm saying? You can argue with me. In other words, my point is this: if I can separate the color from the thing and it's still that thing, if I will still call an ice cube once I remove the blue dye, if I will still, this is still a human being after I remove his melanin, if I say this is still a house when I paint it a different color, then the color isn't essential. It's incidental. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean it doesn't have significance or repercussions, but it's not essential. It's incidental. It's accidental. Is that clear what I mean?
We're talking about ontology.
Say that again?
We're talking about ontology.
Yeah, I think it's an ontological distinction. I think so. Yeah, very good. I think that's a fair way to put it, right? I mean, you could arguably tie this into issues of essentialism. Do you see Jewish people as fundamentally different, or it's hard? Well, that's really a separate discussion. We don't have to go there. But the point being, I think the way you put it is correct. Do you see it as an ontological? Rabbi Clapper is actually the person who taught me that word. So let's scroll down now. So what I want to do is bring this to two Jewish sources, right? Before we look at the sources, does anybody want to just take a guess? If you have a rationalist source and a let's say a more mystically oriented source, which one would you suspect would line up with which position? And it may just be the way you would suspect. Like, do we have an intuition as which way it's more likely to go?
Intuition that the mystical source will say that the color is essential, and the other one will say it's not essential.
Very good. Is that Sipora Machla?
No.
That
Rina,
was
Rina.
right.
Rina, I'm sorry. Thank you, Rina.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I do better when I actually have faces, but all right, let's scroll down.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at the Rambam here. So this is the University of Chicago edition. All this refers to intellectual apprehension and in no way to the eye seeing, as the eye can only apprehend a body, one that is placed in some direction, and in addition, with some of the accidents of the body. I mean, the body's coloring, shape, and so forth, right? So for the Rambam, when you're looking at color, you're talking about an accidental quality. It's something, if you remove it, it doesn't fundamentally change the identity, the nature of the thing you're looking at. It's still fundamentally that thing, right? I guess you could bring up a case of like a painting, right? If you would take away, if you would take a Rembrandt, maybe that's a bad example, Rembrandt. Let's say you take an abstract piece of art where it's a bunch of, it looks like somebody took some colors and they just kind of took some buckets of paint and like splashed it on a canvas.
So
Okay.
Jackson Pollock.
Now, okay, good. So now if you would remove those splotches, so it seems that fundamentally you've changed the thing, I think. I mean, right? I don't know if there's some subjectivity here, right? Alternatively, you could say it's worthless with and it's worthless without. It's the only value there is the canvas. I'm not sure. It depends. Maybe it depends what your attitude towards modern art is. Also, I don't know how.
You improve the value of the canvas.
One more. Say that again. It might devalue the
Improve
canvas.
the value of the canvas.
I think there's room to talk about if you're doing something with intentionality to like the general rules, you're still acknowledging the rules, and that can make something art. But to me, I think the point of Pollock, because that seems to be kind of what you're referencing. I think
I'm
that
not thinking of him in particular, but fine. Go ahead.
that doesn't really have to do with the color aspect of it. Because there's stuff but in an abstract,
Yeah.
like
right,
abstract about abstract, I guess.
Take Rothko.
Yeah.
Rothko is just
Right. Then
Rothko would change his color is not the same painting.
Right.
I didn't catch that.
Oh.
What was that?
Rabbi Clapper was saying a Rothko without color is not the same painting.
Okay, fine. So that's, I'm kind of wondering how that would impact this discussion. Good, thank you. But so now if we take a look at the Shemi Shmuel, but we'll keep it more broad because the point here isn't to get into like an art theory discussion.
Right.
So that if we take a look at the Shemi Shmuel, this is he was the son of the Avnei Nezer. So he takes a different approach. Okay. Now here. All right, so what's going on here? He says, we may skip around here a little bit, but sorry, just 1 minute. Okay. All right, so first I'll just mention, I first became familiar with this source because of a lecture I heard from Rabbi Reichman at YU, who's a huge chassid of the Shemi Shmuel. So then I looked up the source later. So here he's talking about the basic idea of the Shemi Shmuel here is that certain certain foods, and he's bringing this up in the context of the hospitality that Avram and Sarah are showing. Excuse me. And he talks here that v'hainu she'yadua shelechem mityaches li'amin kava chesed, right? So there's this connection, some kind of conceptual connection between bread and chesed. I actually remember Rabbi Reichman said something very interesting, that I believe in the Kabbalah, there's a connection between like daytime in chesed and nighttime in din or gevura. And if you look at like a standard American breakfast, right, it's breakfast cereals, it's grains, it's carbohydrates, right? So it's more like lechem. Then when you're dealing with like the meat, you're dealing with gevura, right? Which again, at least the way Americans eat, you have to look at different parts of the world, but typically somebody would be more likely, at least if not dealing with people, more likely to be eating something heavier with more of a protein type of meal more as the day goes on.
Well, we say that because we're Jews and we don't have bacon with our breakfast.
Right, well, so I do think like in the, maybe called like the middle class, whatever you want to call it, I think that's kind of a standard. That's why I said if you're not living in a farm, or maybe get a heartier meal. But he says, "V'chein kol min basar mityaches l'midat hadin," right, which is intuitive. And forget colors right now. That's just intuitive, right? In other words, you slaughtered the animal. So the idea that that should line up with din doesn't seem so. I think that's fairly intuitive. And then he has a citation from the Zohar. Here, and they say here, Bein harbaim tochlu basar, ubeboker tispo lechem, right? So this connection, we find this idea that in the afternoon there'd be the meat, in the morning there'd be the bread, right? Ki beboker midat chesed, right? So now I want to skip to just get to the color part. Shul chesed here. Okay, ka'asher. Here we go. So with the lechem, bimkomo chema v'chalav, right? When you're dealing with the butter, you're dealing with chalavi things here. You're dealing with butter and milk. That's connected to chesed v'rachamim kenoda, as is known. V'alkein mara shelahem lavan, and that's why they're white. Hipuch basar shemarehu adom. And you're dealing with the meat, which is red, right? And that's not so surprising to think that red might be connected more to din. You think of red, you think of anger. Right? If I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, in the Arnold Lobel story, when he makes everything red, there's this tremendous amount of rage and people are getting into these fights because he's made the world red. That's the only, he's kind of doing one color at a time at one point when he's playing around. So at one point, I think everything is red and you see people quarreling, right? So we have this idea here in the Shem Shmuel of this association between colors and certain attributes that we find in the Sfirot, okay? And I don't think this is something that you just find in the Shem Shmuel, like Rena said, you would find that you would kind of assume this kind of association. So somebody gave us a book years ago with paintings by, I think, a Chabad artist in Israel, and there are all these different paintings where the colors all have like Kabbalistic significance, okay? All right, so the basic idea here, and just to look at this piece, but we don't have to fill it out, right? So we have the idea of how the Rambam and the Sukkot both relate to color. These are the two sources I'm aware of. I'm sure you could find more if you look around. And then the idea here would be to try to line up the sources that we saw above with the Rambam and the Sukkot, right? Again, you guys had other ways of thinking about it. It might be interesting to see if you could sort of do a lineup a little bit differently based on how you were conceptualizing the sources that we saw at the beginning. All right. Do people want to take like an 8-minute break? Does that work for people?
Yes. Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right. So we'll take a break for 8 minutes. I'm going to get a drink of water and come back. If somebody wants to talk to me about something, I'll be here. All right, Yasher Kochchem.
Save myself a little bit of effort there. And see if I can.
Back anyway.
I had a theory about the tefillin that basically maybe they look a lot like tefillin. They kind of look like technology. If you think about it, like don't they look like like iPhones or like something strapped onto you, like some type of a technological device? I thought maybe this was like a precursor to like all these laptops that are all like they look like squares, things like that.
I don't.
Not
see it.
halachically, like more like
I'll just say really
or
quickly.
something.
So
I don't
years
know.
ago,
You're inventing your own.
Yeah,
Chassidus now.
I'm inventing my own Chassidus. Like maybe this is what the tefillin was, a square black box to look like a
the
cell
black
phone
box.
or something. Yeah, like a cell phone is a
Because the
square.
Torah knew that one day there would be cell phones.
Yeah, and it looks really scary. Think about it. Like if like somebody from a third world country like sees a man with tefillin on his forehead, they might think that that's like some type of a bomb.
Oh, that's happened. I know
So
for
I had
sure.
that happen. I had that happen. My wife and I
Yeah,
got
it like
on an
looks like
airplane.
technology. It totally looks like some type of a wire wrapped around your arm. I don't know.
My wife and I got into an airplane in Ithaca, New York, and there was I think a stewardess, and she said to me something like, you know, what are these? I had them in the bag. It's not like I was wearing them. And she said, are they some kind of a device or technology or something like that? And I said, we've been wearing these for thousands of years. There's no, but I said it to try to be disarming, but I think I just rattled her even more. And she found the whole thing it was the opposite experience. I was once in an airplane and I was sitting next to a black woman. And I said, do you mind if I pray next to you? And I said, I have accoutrements, I think was the word I used. And she said to me, put me in your prayers, which was like the most, there was nothing she could have said that would have put me at ease more than that. I think she was reading a book of Psalms at the time. Okay, so we'll take a look at the next clause. So let me just share screen again, but you should have the attachment. Sorry, 1 second. Where is it? Oh, here. There we go. Okay, so I'll just say quickly, the way I wrote this up in the blog, I just thought it was funny, so I'll just recount it quickly. I was in a classroom and a student was listening to music while he was working. It was a song by a contemporary poet, if you're familiar, named Wiz Khalifa. So the song, I looked up the lyrics afterwards, and I have to say, I would have been better off not knowing all the words of the song. But at any rate, what was fascinating about the song was the gist of the song was that as long as I'm just having fun and I'm not harming anyone, I'm good. That's all that matters. Just it's basically and it's an approach to morality that unfortunately isn't so hard to find, right? Which is that as long as I'm not harming you, so what's the harm? It's fine. Everything's fine. So if we take a look here, account that they lost. So George Eliot, she had a very, very different take on things, right? So if you sit down at set of sun and count the acts that you have done, counting find, one self-denying deed, one word, that eased the heart of him who heard, one glance most kind, that fell like sunshine where it went, then you may count that day well spent. But if through all the livelong day, you've cheered no heart by yea or nay, if through it all, you've nothing done that you can trace that brought the sunshine to one face, no act most small, that helps some soul and nothing lost, then count that day as worse than lost, right? It's really a beautiful poem. I don't want to spend time on it now, but if you want to look at it at some point on your own, the rhyme scheme the syllable scheme is really nice in terms of, if you break it up and you write the number of syllables next to each line, there's an elegant pattern there. And I think it's just really a beautiful poem. Fundamentally, what's the message, right? The message here isn't just do nice things, right? I think it's more specific than that. If we had to, well, first of all here, just the contrast between the two stanzas, right, is pretty straightforward. Half the poem is focusing on good and half the poem is focusing on not so good. All right, in one sentence, what's the real message here in the poem? Maybe take like a half minute just to think quietly so that everybody has a chance to think through how they see it. Sorry, I should pull back up here. Does anybody want to say, if you could distill this whole thing in one sentence, what's she trying to emphasize here?
I think it's not just kindness, as you said, but an intentional kindness where you can recognize that you've done something and that you've made some effort or some sacrifice. Just thinking about the self-denying deed. Oh, that might be in conflict with a nothing cost, but
You're saying intentionality.
yeah.
Okay. No, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Right. There's definitely a concept here of cheshbon and nefesh, right? I mean, there's clearly an idea here, which is taking a daily stock, daily inventory, right?
Right.
So
My thought is that if you can't trace back that you've done something kind or good if you weren't really paying attention to what you were doing.
okay, I'm on board with that. I think that makes a lot of sense. No, there's fine. So Jacob's saying there needs to be a certain degree of intentionality. I don't know, maybe mindfulness would be an appropriate term.
Mhm.
Good. Does anybody want to add like a detail onto that? Or a knach or a different approach? Okay, so if it's okay, I'm just going to add one thing to that. I agree with you, and the truth is I wasn't even thinking about it. I wasn't thinking from that angle. I think that's a good point. I think that's correct. I think also it's daily. It has to be daily, right? In other words, it has to be intentional and it has to be regular. It can't be sporadic. It can't be. I feel like doing something nice, and maybe tomorrow I'm not going to feel like doing something nice, and it'll just be based on how I feel. It doesn't work like that, according to her, right? According to this poem, there's an expectation, right? There's an imperative that every single day you're going to do some kind of act of kindness. Right?
It also implies that that's the only kind of value, at least you need that kind of value every day. That you can't spend a day, for example, writing a poem that no one else would read. But it just is really good.
Meaning that's the only thing that imbues the day with being a valuable day?
I don't know if that a day cannot be valuable unless it has been imbued with it. But what I would say is the only thing, right? Because it's interesting because you only need one, right? That's also an interesting finish because you might say that any day which you didn't have room spent bringing kindness to everybody is insufficient. But apparently, it's enough to have one, which is a very makeable position.
Meaning the fact that you can get away with no more than one.
Yeah, this is not true. It might be halacha vein morinkein. Like Kriyashma, right? Obviously the analogy, right? It's morning and night, right? We're afraid that the Balabati won't learn anymore with the same Kriyashma.
Yeah, I was just right. Yeah, that's funny.
But we say it anyway. We don't pass it that way. It's machloket, right? Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, I think. But this is the pub you don't want to give the London.
I mean, I'm fine with counting George Eliot as among like our rabbis who give stock. I'm fine with counting her among that group. She's pretty awesome.
So I do think. So I guess I don't know what Rabbi Clapper said. Just reminds me. I think Rabbi Lamb describes halacha is like the floor and agadata is like the ceiling. So I suppose perhaps she's offering us a more halachic vision of chesed and a less agadic one, maybe. And I hadn't thought about it that way. That's funny. It's kind of odd. Yeah, now that you pointed out, it just seems so like self-evident that it seems to be kind of a low bar. But what I want to take a look at now.
One act of chesed is the difference between well spent and worse than lost.
Well, yeah, it's kind of, I don't want to say harif exactly, but like Rabbi Clapper is pointing out that, on the one hand, it doesn't seem like the highest bar, right? Like Rebbetzin Machlis didn't become who she became by like aiming at one a day. And on the other hand, there's a certain, it's not very forgiving. In other words, it doesn't set a high bar, but if you don't meet it, right, it's worse than lost. It's like it's you're in the negative. You're not in neutral. So let's take a look here. I apologize. I thought the quality would be a little better here. So this is a passage from the Chofetz Chaim's work, Avos Chesed, right? Which, if I remember correctly, the first part deals more with halachos, really dealing with things like paying a worker on time, etc. But there's also a lot of agadic material, I think, in the second half. Hopefully I remember that correctly. If we take a look, let's see, I think we're going to skip down. He's talking about some of the benefits. It's kind of a crass term to use here, but some of the benefits that one may receive, right? In terms of doing acts of kindness. But what I want to do is down here right now. I'm going to read this how I naturally read anyway, more Ashkenazis, especially because like with the Chofetz Chaim, to me, it doesn't feel, I don't know. It's like I heard somebody giving a shir with Rav Kook, and he said it's Rav Kook, so I'm reading it in Ashkenazis because that's how he spoke Hebrew anyway. So he says, right? It can't be missing and it's interesting, he doesn't say Maaseh Chesed. I'm not even sure if I noticed this before. He doesn't say Maaseh Chesed and Midas HaChesed. Itself, I think, is kind of interesting. But that attribute of kindness shouldn't be missing even one day. Right? Every day, person has to make it a point to do some Torah learning. They also have to do chesed every day, right? It's kind of funny. Maybe you could argue based on this passage that really if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the women's learning programs in Israel, I think, tend to have more of a stress on doing chesed activities. But maybe the yeshiva programs really need to implement that also, according to this, right? Maybe that really needs to be more equal in this regard. So now he's going to a Kabbalistic source. Right? I think lisanin is a pretty strong term, right? The person is really supposed to be aggrieved about the fact that they didn't learn and they didn't do chesed on that particular day. Now, this is an interesting point here. He says, right? If I'm not mistaken, I heard Rabbi Tzvi Ram point this out, that you have a dispute, right? How we understand the whole idea of avodah in terms of the three pillars, right? The Chofetz Chaim theoretically could have said, well, we still have tefillah, right? But not everybody learns that way. Some people understand, no, one of them is gone, right? Avodah is avodah, means korban, and we don't have it right now. Right? So we really have to be really strong about these things. And that's how we're going to get forgiveness. Right? So there's this idea where he says that a person has to be mitonein daily, right? That the Torah, the chesed was lost. I'm going to skip down. Right? It talks about the atoning power involved in acts of kindness. And then he says here, right? So up to this point, right, he's been saying that, so we only have two of the three pillars. So obviously, we have to be particularly strong about them. And he says, Aval, MS, afilu bizman shaya mikdash kayam, גם כן, היה צריך האדם להסתפק תמיד כל ימי חייו במידות הקדושה של טוב וחסד. Right, so even when you're at the base of Mikdash, we had the temple, it was still essential. It's always been essential to be attached to this quality. Here we go. בטעם לחוזה, כי ידוע מזוהר הקדוש, שימי האדם שהוא חי על האדמה כולם חיים וקיימים לנצח. This is a wild sounding idea that a person's days constantly exist. It's not that a person lived yesterday and yesterday is in the past. No, yesterday still exists. דהיינו, שמכל יום ויום נעשה בריאה רוחנית קדושה. There's some kind of a spiritual reality, creation literally, but reality maybe, that is created on a daily basis. ולעשי לבוא בבוא זמנו להתפקד מן העולם, באים כל ימיו למעלה עמו להעיר עליו לפני אדון הכל. Right? So when the person comes for the judgment, all of those days are going to come along to testify. It's very reminiscent, I think, of the Rashi, where he says that with Abraham, right? I forget if he says with Avram or Sarah, that every single day was lived. Okay, I think that the George Eliot poem really echoes this idea very tightly, right? That there are certain things that one cannot miss. It's daily. A day cannot go by without this thing. And you see that her thinking seems to be very, very much along the lines of what we see in this source from Chaim Vital. Any comments, questions, arguments?
One comment is that like we know that like physically there are a lot of things we don't skip each day, like food, I don't know, going to the bathroom, whatever it is. So it's like I agree that like there should also be spiritual things that we shouldn't skip if possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. In other words, chesed could be viewed almost like a spiritual nutrition. That's interesting. Well, Torah is compared to water, right? You don't go without water. Interesting. Okay, thank you.
I guess it's especially to refer to the yeshiva.
What's that?
We can put Chassidut in, on yeshivas on Mondays and Thursdays.
We only eat like 2 times. It'll be like that kind of diet when you only eat like fasting diet.
Intermittent
When what is it? Intermittent fasting? Then you won't really.
Right, but only we're talking Kriyas Torah on Mondays and Thursdays. So if it's parallel to.
There needs to be individual chesed every day.
No, but every day we're learning Torah, right?
Institutional chesed should only be on Mondays and Thursdays.
I'm also failing to resist the word I was told in the name of the Yehuda that he said after a failed appeal, he closed the base medrash. I asked him why. He said, well, a 3-legged stool stands on its own. A 2-legged stool you lean against the wall. But a 1-legged stool, the only thing you can do is take the last leg off and put it on the floor.
Can I ask where you saw that story?
I think it was told to me at camp. It was very memorable.
That was who again? I'm sorry.
I heard
Note of
it,
Yehuda? That was you said the Note of Yehuda or no?
It was told to me about the Note of Yehuda. That was his tactic to get everyone to give for the appeal, is that they couldn't deal with the base medrash being closed. And that was his explanation to that. So you can't have the base medrash unless you have stucco too, because you can't. There's no point in the 1-legged stool.
I just sent 2 more sources so that you don't have to rely on the way it looks on the screen again. Rabbi Clapper, do those ready?
Yeah, let's think. Let me forward that.
right now.
Well, we're still getting Mendel, so I can't imagine not. Are we still getting Mendel? I thought I heard him there. Nope.
Oh, dear.
Oh,
Oh,
towards the Zoom.
yeah.
Oh, your Zoom is frozen. Mine is not.
Yes, but
I
he's
don't know
the
why
one.
your computer's.
Okay, I think everyone's got it.
Well, I think he didn't
Okay.
actually.
Oh, you guys
send
didn't
it.
actually send it yet?
Yeah.
I got stuck. Sorry. What? You were right. I did not send it. Good catch. Good catch.
Yeah.
All right, so that I'm gonna just throw a question out there. Is anybody familiar with the Side School series, Lewis Sackar?
We didn't make out the words,
Wait.
Mendel. Say it again.
Is anybody familiar with Lewis Sackar's Wayside School series?
Yes.
Okay,
I haven't read the one that came out last year, but
do you have a Kindle?
I don't.
Because I could lend it to you. If you get the app, I can lend it to you. The app is free. It's worthwhile. The ending is beautiful. I have a blog post on it, but it's just forget. It's beautiful. It's so sweet. It's such a nice ending. That's how you know the series is over, because it has a nice ending. She's always like, no, throughout the whole series. And then at the end, you just have a good feeling for her. And it's like, well, that's got to be the end of the series then. So anyway, for anybody who's not familiar, I only became familiar with it like the last 2 years. It's a great children's book series by Lewis Sackar. Wrote, I think, a book called Holes. He's written different things, but this is really it's a very fun series with like short episodes, short scenes. So I'm just going to read a short passage, and then we're going to take a look at a source sheet that deals with something that emerges from that. This is not going to, you know what, I'll just, first I'll share a screen with what I'm reading off of, just so you can see it if you want to. All right. All right. So this is, we have the following passage. Mrs. Jules is the children's teacher for almost the entire series. Mrs. Jules began the arithmetic lesson. She wrote on the blackboard, 2 + 2 = 5. That's wrong, Joyce shouted. Mrs. Jules tried again. 2 + 2 = 3. That wasn't right either. She added 2 and 2 again and got 43. It was useless. No matter how hard she tried, she could not get 2 + 2 to equal 4. I don't understand it, she said. They've always equaled 4 before. Right? Later in the story, Mrs. Jules picked up the piece of chalk from the floor. That's what she said. When 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, anything can happen. All right, so that's, now I want to take a look at a source sheet. All right. All right, do we see the word apopular or the phrase apopular? Okay, fine. Right, so we have the classic question that every budding philosopher from like first grade to the end of college asks, right? Can God make a rock that he can't lift, or make a wall he can't break, or however you want to, you know, formulate the question. So the question really is, can God do that which is logically impossible? Okay, so before we look at any sources, okay, I just want to take like, I realize it's getting late here. Let's take give yourselves 5 minutes or 4 minutes. 4 minutes, good on a lot of time. 4 minutes. Just quietly think, and if you write down to yourselves, can you think of a spread of 4 different positions on this issue, right? Maybe you can come up with 10. I don't know, but you know, I don't think I can personally. But if you can, fine, right? But what do you think could be a potential spread, okay, of positions?
Are we answering whether God can create a rock that he can't lift, or whether God can do something that's
So
logical?
here, the way I set it up on in the columns here would be a minimal understanding of divine omnipotence, a maximal understanding, and intermediate positions, right? You know, presumably maximal understanding would just be that, God can do everything and there's no need to apologize for logical issues or something like that, then, what could be the minimum and still be called omnipotent, right? Does that make sense the way I just said that? No, okay. And all right, fine.
Isn't
Another way,
omnipotent by definition maximal?
okay, good. Good. So you, Tani, if I'm not mistaken, used the word ontological before. So if I'm not mistaken, like in an epistemological issue that comes up, how do we know things? So you could talk about something which by its very nature is unknowable. So lack of knowing it in that case isn't a deficiency because it's not something that's knowable in the first place.
Right.
So if you have something that is definitionally not doable, then not being able to do it might not constitute a deficiency. Does that make sense? Is that clear the way I just said it?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, we got 2 minutes to ponder. So about 1 minute left, and then we'll hear what people have to say before looking at sources. This is pretty subtle. So if you don't come up with more than, if you don't come up with 4 distinct positions, don't beat yourself up about it. Like it's not. Okay.
I have 10 so far, but I can try to.
Wait.
No?
When I said 10, I was kind of joking. Did you really come up with 10?
Yeah, I have 10 so far.
One of you could just favorite.
There are a lot.
In
There
4
are a
minutes?
lot-
Oh no, I want to
Yeah,
hear.
no, many of these I hadn't thought of before, but to be fair, it's closer to 5 because a lot of them are just the same thing, but with rules of logic versus the rules of physics.
Oh, wow.
So you can multiply all of them by 2 just by doing that. So it's really closer to 5.
We love
Wow. No, you're on target. So. Okay, good. No, so okay, I want to hear what you have.
Sure, I'll list them. Let's start with the maximal one, which is God can do anything, even logically impossible things. That's the simplest one.
Okay.
God can adjust the rules of logic, but has to adjust them before doing anything, and he has to adjust them retroactively. So these were always the rules of logic. Because God is outside time. Slightly less omnipotent, but basically can still do anything he wants, but requires, I guess, having always
now
done
there's
that.
a limitation of it has to be retroactive. Okay, fine.
Right, meaning the rules of logic can't change, but God can still do anything, even logically impossible things.
Because he changes the rules retroactively.
Such
Fine.
that they were always this way, yes.
Okay, fine.
Next is God set up the rules of logic in such a way that he will never need to adjust them to do anything he wants. Just a slight, subtle variation on the previous one. God already knew everything he'd ever have to do, and he set up the rules of logic to allow him to do everything he would ever have to do.
Okay, fine.
God, slightly less one is God can do logically impossible ones, but chooses not to. God never chooses to do logically impossible things, even though it is technically in his capacity.
Or at least he never chooses to both do and not do logically impossible things.
Sure.
It's a really subtle distinction. The problem is I feel like I need to sit on what you're saying with all these subtleties.
Right. And another one is God can adjust the rules of logic, doesn't need to do them retroactively, but must adjust the rules of logic. God can't just create a contradiction. He has to first say that there's no such thing as a contradiction and now create a contradiction. That contradictions are logically possible, then create a contradiction.
But then that's still more wiggle room than the prior one, which.
Sure.
Okay, fine.
And then we can go to just double these basically all things that are physically impossible. And you could basically apply all these straightforwardly to that.
Really interesting. Okay, let's take a look here. Does anybody else want to weigh in before we look at sources?
You didn't even bring in the more minimal positions, right? Like that God can only do things that are within a system of logic, which may be more objective than God is.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. I left out what we define as logic of physics. I might even define logic. I thought that was just a distraction, but you could define logic even as narrowly as the Rambam does and say things like a flying ship are logically impossible. Which logic can bleed into physics, and you can have different definitions of what you mean by rules of logic in any of these. And I was trying to really focus on like when you change the positions and not so much get into like what do we mean by rules of logic.
You were thinking more categorically.
But I just don't want to, because you could spend forever defining what are the set of rules God has to adhere to. You could have any set of rules God has to adhere to. And I was trying to get to like, does he adjust the rules more than what are the rules?
Einstein stopped telling God what to do.
So okay, very
Okay, I
interesting.
have another comment. I don't know if you would have said this or not. I'm not
Oh,
sure, but just in case you didn't say it, God maybe can do everything and change the rules of logic, but he doesn't want to necessarily. He said, okay, well done.
I
Very
came
good.
up with
Okay, a self-imposed limitation, right?
I came up with some of it wasn't really dealing with logic the way I framed things. More just kind of vague, well, not exactly vague, but things I've picked up as ideas of what God can and can't control. So maximally, it's like God can do everything. Intermediate, I guess, intermediate B, everything but that which is logically impossible. Intermediate A, everything but control human thought and that which is logically impossible. And then the minimal power, the minimal omnipotence, I framed that as a power beyond human comprehension, but not necessarily literally omnipotence, which isn't going into the realm of logic, but it could be just we can't completely understand omnipotence is the best way to frame it.
Wait, I'm sorry, hold up. In other words, maximal, no logical contradictions or violations, let's say, no violations of logic, no restriction of human thought or coerced human thought. What was the last one?
The last one is not really omnipotent, but it's kind of like, it's saying not literally omnipotent, but it's still so powerful that we can't comprehend.
Oh.
So it's saying it's not a literal omnipotence, maybe is the way of understanding.
What would it even mean for God to change the rules of logic?
Well, I could get into this later. Personally, this isn't such an interesting question to me because I don't think the rules of logic are inherent in the universe at all. I think they're just part of human minds and how humans perceive the universe. I'm very Kantian in this way. So to me, this is not such an interesting question.
Basically, like if you rephrase it, a question of to what extent you think logic really exists.
Well, it could exist in the universe as is, but if you think the laws of physics are arbitrary in this universe, there's laws of logic.
Right. So
Right, the laws of logic can be equally arbitrary, just like it's pretty
Yeah,
obvious to any of us
logic
that God.
really
Then
is.
there wouldn't be rules at all.
What? I mean, if God could change them?
Why not?
why would
Make
it-
different.
We can change laws by voting, and there's still obviously rules. There just has to be some degree of inertia. That's all.
Outside time.
That would make you learn assumptions.
And even if you live in a dictatorship with a king, there are still laws, even though the king can arbitrarily change them at any point. King still follows the law. Like take the Purim story with Achashverosh. That's a bad example because he can't change them. But if Achashverosh could have changed it, it would still have been the law. Doesn't make it not a rule just because Achashverosh can change it any time.
I mean,
there's a
there's
constitutional convention for God to change the rules of life.
I think that, I mean, there's like the scientific evidence that the constants of the universe might not be as constant as we think.
What rules of logic would God be changing?
Usually get rid of the exclude middle. That's the biggest mess.
Which is which one?
The one that says you can't be A and not A at the same time.
Okay.
And we just look at light and we say, why not?
Right. So if light can be both a particle and wave at the same time, clearly it's
Like you
not
have a particle and not particle at the same time, right? So that's right. The universe doesn't seem to be
not a
following the rules.
correct rule of logic. Then.
Well, that's generally, there are many ways in which the universe doesn't follow the rules of logic. One thing is logic generates paradoxes. That's the whole problem. But there are all sorts. You can change it the same way you can change details of geometry. You can change details of logic, and see what happens as a result.
I'm not understanding that. Okay. We can
Same way Miriam had trouble with non-Euclidean geometry.
Right.
We just changed one of the parameters, right?
But it wasn't changed, because it was always that way. We just didn't know about it.
You could think that, but I could be Calvin's dad.
I missed that.
Either way, I just feel the need to object as someone who studied a little bit of physics that particles and wave paradox is not actually a logical paradox in any meaningful sense of the world. It should not be the basis of your epistemology.
All right.
It's just saying that there are minuscule quantum effects that humans can describe in different ways, and they're useful to describe in different ways in different situations. And it's not actual paradox. They're not like both a particle and a wave. Those are two different ways they're useful to describe these tiny quantum particles.
We can argue this later.
Maybe like the rule of logic, like morality as a form of logic. Like right now it's logical for us to say that like murdering people is a bad thing. But what if God were to change it and say, no, like actually, like I'm gonna change everybody's minds, and now everybody is gonna think it's logical. Actually, they should murder. It's like a mitzvah to murder people every day. Let's say. So
What's funny? I'll throw in. I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
Changing the rules of what?
Well,
No. Finish your thought first.
Yeah, that was my thought basically, that like right now most people I think consider it illogical to murder, or like immoral to murder, but that's how we feel, right? And then but what if that was changed?
I think like there's like a similar question, right? To what extent do you think the laws of morality are objective things built into the universe that are alterable?
Yeah.
Or not alterable, right? Same as with logic, right? We can play out this whole spectrum without any reference to God, right? With reference to whether something can change those.
We have to define logic first, because you could say it won't be logic once you change it, right? So we get to terminological.
Right, but fundamentally, you can have this whole dispute about logic. You can have this whole
Sure.
dispute about morals, and it would be basically the same spectrum of opinions, with or without like making it about a method.
We could have left out the options that God can choose, which are just percepting, like God can do anything He wants, but only after making human beings perceive it as possible or something. Right? That would only change human minds. Or God can only do those things that human beings are willing to be convinced are not that there is a logical solution to in the end. But not that no one will.
I'm not sure the universe exists in any meaningful sense outside of human minds. I'm not sure what that means, if that's useful. That's a useful distinction at all.
I would argue that if something can be both true and not true at different points in time, then it's not a rule that it's true, and it's not a rule that it's not true.
Tani, do you mean ethically, or do you mean like 2 + 2 = 4?
Yeah, 2 + 2 = 4. If at one point in time 2 + 2 = 4, and another point in time 2 + 2 = 5, then in my view here, then it's not a rule that 2 + 2 = 4.
But you're happy with the retroactive changes? You're happy with God changing it so 2 + 2 was always 5?
Yeah, because then 2 + 2 is always 5.
Huh. And you're okay with that, but you're not okay with changing halfway through.
Because
That's really interesting.
That's not a change.
Well, let's take a real life thing. There's some evidence, non-zero amount of evidence, that the speed of light has changed. Does that mean the speed of light is not a constant? But there was a period of time when the speed of light changed. There's some amount of evidence, not a huge amount. But
You only construct a rule: 2 + 2 = 4 on Mondays and 2 + 2 = 5 on Tuesdays.
Okay, fine. So that's always a rule then.
Well, I'm saying that's then you don't need to, because you can. It just depends how finely grained you have the rule: 2 + 2 = 4, except on the third Monday of October in 2016.
Okay, fine. So the rule is always like that. Okay.
Or so can God also make the rule that gravity attracts things towards each other, except when Yehoshua says Shemesh b'givon dom alone?
As long as we're being consistent about that the rule.
Fine. So that's okay. As long as the rule can have particular people's names and particular sentences they have to say in it, but it's still fine as a rule, as long as that's the rule.
I mean, there's at least one opinion, I don't remember who it is, that like all the miracles were built into the fabric of creation.
Yes.
It's
There are.
Rambam, right?
I think it's implied in the Midrash, isn't it, Rabbi Clapper, with the things created before?
A lot of us are Rambam or something.
Well,
I think the
well,
Rambam does.
there are lots of positions like it, so I don't need, I don't know that in the Medrash will be read by, every philosopher read the same Medrash, so they have different ways of reading it.
There's certainly at least one position that like laws of science are X, except when they were originally
Yes,
built into
exactly right.
creation. That's that. I don't think I think that's fine.
And there are rationalists who are happy with that because their problem is changing God's mind, not changing the rules of the universe. They don't need the universe to be.
I mean, in terms of science, I have a different philosophy on that. But in terms of like the ruleness of rules, like a rule can have exceptions, but that's part of the rule.
I think you're the kind of philosophy that led to that article about Shemesh B'Kivot Dome, where they tried to trace it back to decide which solar eclipse it was talking about. And in the end, they managed to conclude that there was a solar eclipse about the right time, and it's entirely possible this whole story is the story of Yeshua correctly predicting a solar eclipse.
I mean, one thing I've thought about in the past, which is a little bit relevant to some of the comments, is just so if you take the idea of Hashem looking into the Torah, and that's the blueprint in a sort of literal way, so then obviously all the morality has to precede has to precede the creation. I think if you look at the Shmona Prakim, at least the way I understood it in the past, was that Hashem gave the Torah to the human being who was already constructed in a certain way, and the Torah is supposed to have a certain kind of an effect on a human being. In which case you could ask, well, if instead of human beings, Hashem had been working with highly intelligent sharks, right? Let's say sharks had evolved to be the dominant life form on the planet. So maybe in that case, killing would be appropriate because part of a shark's function, if we could talk about functions, is to call out the weak things in the sea, right? That seems to be part of what they do. So in that case, I think to some degree you can ask to what extent the morality is inherent in the reality and to what extent it's, I don't know if superimposed is exactly the right word, but Hashem's giving the rules to a particular type of creature. At any rate, if it's okay, if we take a quick look at the sources, because we don't have a lot of time. I had another sheet we could look at, but I'm not sure we really have the time to work with it here. So we have 4 sources given in chronological order. I want to be clear, these are not all coming from primary sources. So this one is, right? The Rambam writes, I think this is a typo here, I think it should be as. Now, as for us, the matter is clear in our opinion, namely, that all things exist in virtue of a purpose and not of necessity, and that he who purposed them may change them and conceive another purpose, though not absolutely any purpose whatever. For the nature of impossibility is stable and cannot be abolished, as we shall make clear, right? So what can somebody tell us, just in simple English, as opposed to University of Chicago English, what is the Rambam saying here?
Sounds like God can do anything that doesn't contradict the rules of logic.
Okay, good. Exactly. Thanks, Tony. In other words, as long as it's not a violation of logic, right? Without getting into different readings of the Mor Nevuchim, right? The simple understanding of the Rambam is that he understands that the world was created ex nihilo, yesh me'ayin. Okay. Now that may be impossible in terms of physics, right? But that doesn't have to be a logical impossibility. All right. Now, this I got from this is Raphael Shuchat's translation. I think he's a professor of Jewish thought in, I don't know if it's Bar Ilan, I forget where. But he has a book, and one of the sources he cites here is the Rashba on this topic. What we told in time.
Where's the
I apologize. I think a couple typos in this sheet. Probably should be what we were told and taught. To allow the idea that some of the logical impossibilities have a stable nature, even for God, right? So he's referring to the Rambam here, presumably, specifically among those certain ideas that are needed for Torah faith, for they are the root and base that all the rest depend upon. They are, for example, that God make another God like himself, or that he incarnate himself, or cause any change in himself. For we do not believe that the blessed God can be described as capable of such a thing as the great Rabbi of blessed memory wrote. Enumerated among these impossibilities are other necessary ideas of faith, making it impossible to explain it all in writing. Now, Raphael Shuchat has a particular way he presents this idea in his book. Does anybody want to venture to say how this might be different than what we saw in the prior source?
It's kind of like there are different types of logical impossibilities, and some God can do some logical impossibilities God can perform, and some God can't.
No, I think you're on the right track. The way he presents it, as I believe, is that God can't violate. I may be presenting a little bit more restricted than the way he puts it, but God can't violate a logical rule that would undermine in ikar emuna, a fundamental tenet of Jewish belief, right? But okay, let's leave it at that. That would be the idea. So, for example, right, he can't make another God like himself, right? So that would obviously violate the idea of Yichud Hashem, right? He cannot cause any change in himself. That might connect to the idea of the Torah not being exchanged for another law, right? Because that would imply a change of mind, right, etc. So the Rashba, the way Raphael Shuchat explains, is that God cannot contradict something which would undermine Jewish faith. All right, let's.
But it's so
take a look. Yeah, go ahead.
do any impossibility that wouldn't make Christianity possible.
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
If you wanted to put it cynically, you could say that God can do any impossibility except the ones that would make Christianity possible.
If you are defined in anti-Christian terms, so that would make sense.
That's the way he seems to be defining it, right? He doesn't choose any of the other ones.
But it's very circular, isn't it? Isn't it drawing the target around the arrow? You do it that way? Things we already decided are impossible, God can't do, but anything we haven't decided is impossible, God can't. Right.
I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the Rashba, it's worth pointing this out historically, right? He is working in a Christian context. He's not working in an Islamic context. He's in Christian Spain.
But there are other Ikari Muna that he would have chosen in a Muslim context, presumably. Like God can't, like contradict his previous revelation to the final prophet.
Right, but I think he would sign on that also. In other words, I could be wrong on this point, but I suspect that he's going to accept the things that the Rambam refers to as Ikari Emuna. And if that's right, I think he would sign off on that as well. And again, this is speculative now. I can't swear on this, but when he says cause any change in himself, that might already be alluding to something along those lines. Because once he's endorsing a replacement law, that might imply, right, that seems to be a change of position.
But maybe. I mean, he might. I mean, he could also just be saying that God can't change his own essential attributes.
Yeah, I was gonna say something like that.
The Rashba feels different to me than the Rambam. The Rambam feels like he's really saying there are limits to God's omnipotence, can't do impossible things. To me, the Rashba is saying more along the lines of the same way I can't go into the shul right now and murder all of you. That's just not in my current. It's not a physical possibility. I know where there are knives, I know where there are guns, I could do it, but it's not the kind of thing I can do because I'm not that kind of person. I feel like the Rashba is saying more of that. He's saying more similar to, it's not a limit to my physical strength or possibility that I can't go murder all of you right now. It's a limit to the kind of person I am. I'm not the kind of person who goes into a shul and commits mass murder. So Rashba is saying something like that. He's not saying, I'm not sure Rashba is really saying it's not possible for God to create a body and puppet it. I don't think the Rashba really thinks that. It's not even that hard of a thing to do. It's just, Rashba is saying God is not that kind of person, essentially, which isn't really a limit to his omnipotence in the way that Rambam's conception of there are things that are really impossible is a limit to God's omnipotence.
Mm-hmm. No, I disagree. I'm with Rabbi Clapper. It sounds like saying that like God by definition is singular and intangible and unchanging, and therefore it would be a logical impossibility for God to change any of those things.
So we could say that because God is currently unchanging, he can never change, because the God to become changing would in and of itself be a change. But I think it's just a semantic, I think at that point we're just arguing semantics. I think I'm not sure if people are thinking as rigidly logically as we like to in the modern day because of, the invention of logic. But I think the feel is very different. I don't think, even though the Rashba thinks of himself as quoting the Rambam, I think the Rambam, I think the feel of it is very different. It feels more like the way I can't go murder all of you than like the way I can't go, fly and catch an airplane and bring it to the ground under my own power.
Does the Rashba think of himself as quoting the Rambam?
He says as Rambam wrote.
Yeah.
But he only says it about the last thing. He doesn't claim that his entire
Right.
He says some of the logical possibilities of stable nature even for God. I think according to the Rambam, all the logical possibilities.
Right, but like from a statistician's point of view, the likelihood of me going into the shul and committing mass murder is just the same as the likelihood of me flying under my own power, catching an airplane, and bringing it back to the ground. But I feel like one of them is a limit to my powers. I am less of a capable person because I can't go catch an airplane that's flying and bring it down. I'm not less of a capable person because I can't go murder everybody.
I understand the argument, but it might just be the Rashba is willing to believe in possibilities. And
Maybe.
wants to limit the number of impossibilities he believes in. So he takes a position which isn't perfectly coherent. Which is okay, because God has to be logically coherent.
Also,
Like I said, I think you don't think the Rashba is limiting God's omniscience less than the Rambam is, even though he thinks of himself as adding things?
He is definitely, because he thinks.
We lost.
Oh, no.
Lost Mendel again?
I mean, the video.
No,
Working.
we were still talking to me and I'm somewhere else.
Looks like
We lost the presenter. We did not lose internet. Your internet is fine. You're still
It's
talking
not
to me.
hard.
So this is on the end. Well, we can find it out meanwhile.
It hasn't been on our end, so we can
I think
suddenly
yes.
feel guiltless for all the other.
I think there's no doubt that the Rashba believes that God can do things that the Rambam thought he couldn't. The question, what you want to argue is that if he can do any logical impossibilities, he must be able to do all. And that I'm not sure that the Rashba, that would be true if God were bound by logic.
So I think that kind of question might not have been important to the Rashba. I don't think the Rashba is terribly interested in whether God can do logical impossibilities in the way that I think the Rambam was terribly interested in that.
I think that's much more. I think the end of the day is that the Rambam really cares about philosophy and the Rashba not so much.
Yes.
Well, where is this Rashba? Is the Rashba a philosophy book?
Rashba has several long tshuvot about philosophy. So that would be my bet, right? That it's in one of the very long tshuvot. Pardon?
I tried to ask earlier, like where it's from.
Right. I don't think I think that's where I think the Rashba has tshuvot that are long replies to people asking questions like that. Well, Mendel's cat is back.
Hello.
Aw.
It's a very cute cat.
There's calories in that.
Okay.
One of my kids put that up. I was sufficiently into it that I didn't pay any attention to what percentage my computer was on, and it crashed.
No, you died. Power died. Okay, so we've only got 3 minutes left. So you might as well sum up.
All right, so I'm going to read to you the Ralbag. Reinhold's presentation, Dr. Reinhold. He has a very excellent book, An Introduction to Medieval Jewish Philosophy, and he writes the following: certain features of existence are so fundamental for Gersonides that anything we can conceive of as existing must answer to them. Most significantly, quote, it is assumed as a self-evident axiom in physics that nothing is generated from nothing. This and various other scientific considerations, such as the impossibility of a vacuum, led him to argue against creation ex nihilo. Then he has a quote, but we don't have enough time. So now I'm going to skip to Rabbi Tzvi Freeman. I got a book years ago from a friend of mine who's a Chabadnik. I think it's called Bringing Heaven Down to Earth. And he has an interesting quote, which I'll read. The miracle of Hanukkah was that one flask of oil burned for 8 days. Some say the oil burned, but new oil miraculously appeared each day. Some say the oil wasn't really burning, but the flame was miraculous. The theories go on and on. Why do we limit God with our logic? Say simply the flame was burning oil, but the oil was not burning. God could do anything, or can do anything. He could even, as the saying goes, fit an elephant through the eye of a needle. So how would he do it? Would he make the elephant smaller, or would he expand the eye of the needle? Neither. The elephant would remain big, the eye of the needle small, and he would fit the elephant through the eye of the needle. Illogical, true, but logic is just another of his creations. If you created logic, is permitted to disregard it. Right. So obviously there's like a spread of positions, and I know at one point, the way I tended to think about it was that if one says that we're a product of evolution and we evolved to work within a particular framework, so there's no reason to think that we can operate outside of that framework, right? So we're products of within this physical framework. So the idea that we could somehow transcend that within our own, faculties doesn't necessarily follow. But obviously there are different ways of approaching this. Anyway, if I'm assuming the clock on my computer is correct, which it is not necessarily always, we have less than 2 minutes. So if anybody's interested, I could send you, oh no, I did send you the other one. So I'll just let you know what it is. The other attachment, which I sent, is based on a passage from the play from the Harry Potter series. I guess you could call it book 8 if you want, where there's a little bit of a back and forth between Harry Potter and his wife Ginny. Hopefully I didn't spoil anything for anybody who never got to the 7th book.
Yeah, I kind of think like as opposed to the 8th book, we should refer to as the pseudepigrapha.
Well, the thing is, she gave her stamp of approval on it, so I don't know
They
how
say.
What?
Go on, man. We're sorry.
I'm sure Shlomo wrote many Mishlei, which were lost because they didn't quite make it into Mishlei.
At any rate, it's a very nice. I didn't catch what Rabbi Clapper said. So, if you look at that, I think it ties in very beautifully with a passage from Rabbi Wurzburger, who, if I recall correctly, Rabbi Clapper is a great fan of his writings on ethics. So he has a very nice article where he talks about, and I think it really got me to think differently about morality being affected by the web of relationships that we exist in, instead of being some kind of abstract Kantian idea. And then there's a very nice quote from Professor Michael Wishegrod, which I think moves in the same direction. Though kind of, I guess, interestingly, the quote comes from an introduction written to a collection of essays, which was written by a evangelical Protestant theologian, but he is quoting Professor Wishegrod. So, but I think that both of those have affected the way I think about what morality really is, and made it less abstract and more concrete, more something that has to do with the daily lives that we lead, which I think very much comes out of that argument between Harry and Ginny, where she's much more based on what I think of probably as being a more true morality, as opposed to some kind of lofty, stuffy idea, which doesn't really deal with actual human beings. Anyway, I hope that people benefited from this. I enjoyed it a lot. And my wife enjoyed it too, because she said it was sufficiently distracting that she couldn't read what she was intending to read. So Baruch Hashem, we benefited.
Okay.
Rabbi Clapper, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a really pleasure. I don't think I've ever heard you teach before, or at least not in many, many years. This was much fun.
I'm glad. Thank you.
It's a great deal of fun. Wave to Abby, and
she waves back.
Hopefully, I'll get to meet. Hopefully, the pandemic will at least pause long enough to allow me to visit this year.
I would love to see you again. Yeah, it would be really nice.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Regards
you.
to all.
Everybody be healthy.
Amen.
I hope so.